Hi, welcome to GP Crash Course Part 3. So I'm going to continue from where I was in the Part 2 section. Now I'm going to be explaining what exactly the introduction is. So as you can see from this slide, it says that, okay, you don't need to lay out all your points. Now why do I say this? Because this is not really a secondary school essay. Because in GP, you basically get like the freedom uh, to write and also to develop your own writing style, which is a bit different from secondary school because they really are interested in just clear structure. Now, you need to give yourself the freedom. If not, you're not going to enjoy GP either because this is actually very useful, especially for you guys who are going to local universities where it is compulsory to take, like, let's say, Singapore studies or like modules that basically require you to write. So this is a very useful skill. And despite the fact that, in university, of course, the level is different, but this doesn't necessarily mean that the skills that you learn in GP are completely useless, right? So, and I think what is important is that because your A levels is coming pretty soon, like in a few months' time, so you can't really force your brain to like something that unless you make the conscious effort. So this is why bombarding your essay with difficult words and all that stuff, it's not going to earn you an A unless your analysis is good enough, right? So let me move on to the next slide. Okay, so, okay, as you can see, this is a pretty content-heavy slide. Now, we have already discussed about the introduction, right? So I've already shown how an example can lead to background context that enable you to conclude that Singapore society has not become more inclusive. Now, after this, we need to get into your counter argument. Now, why is this so? The reason why counterarguments are so important and has to be put in the beginning is because they establish your acknowledgement of the other side of the coin, but we also want to write it precisely in the beginning because it makes your essay stronger. Now, I'll talk about this more when we get to the argument section. Okay, so I've written the paragraph on this slide. It's not entirely complete. You guys can find your own data. The thing is that it is tempting to just write a very weak counterargument by talking about governmental policies that are ineffective in solving the problem of integration, as civil society tends to have a greater influence in this issue. Now, this goes to any kind of question. It's not only about this. The reason why um, a lot of people don't do well is because they feel that, okay, I'm going to argue from like this side and you're not going to make the counter argument strong because you have to be slightly biased in that sense. But the problem with GP is that you have to be balanced, but you have to show that your side is actually stronger. Now, this is the reason why the counter argument has to be put first, right? Okay, so we have to think hard and talk about the significance of some events that we may not think are useful. Now, when I was on the debate team, it was really enlightening in that sense because I was forced to not talk about morals, right? So the moral argument is generally very, very much weak because not everybody believes in that, and it's not entirely universal for some people because it is influenced by some religious beliefs. So this is the reason why when you back up your arguments with data, it has to be raw data. It has to be something concrete. It can't just be what you think. It has to be what, well, you have to write it in such a way that makes it seem as if people also think the same way as you do. This is why um, you will generally use like the word most for, like, let's say, to describe your argument because you want to show that, okay, a lot of people actually feel this way because the facts are this, right? So, okay, now for example, co-CCA basically may not entirely bond students because we were talking about CCAs before this, but this doesn't mean that it's not possible. So what did I just do? I basically talked about like something that is close to your heart, and I think you should really look at things that are around you. It doesn't have to be very intelligent, but just make a strong analysis on that. So, in terms of CCA, this is a part of educational policies, right? So the thing about this counter argument is that you want to show that the government also actually care about integration, and actually the society has become more inclusive because of how the government has been dealing with it. So CCA is definitely one of the ways because educational policies come from the government, right? So it becomes, this kind of platform is like non-academic, so it becomes an avenue for like-minded people to come together for a vision, generally for like Singapore Youth Festival, or like let's say for sports competitions, in order to get the school proud and for you yourself, because it's an achievement. So they at least have a common goal and they have to work together for it. Now in a class, the goal is very individualistic, as academic excellence is achieved alone without other people's help, right? So this is different, so that in CCA, teamwork is fostered, and this is an important skill that the class, especially in Singapore, doesn't teach. Now, this may seem like a very secondary school argument. Now, the reason why it has to be also be there is because you want to give like a raw introduction to the issue, and then you can give like more examples. Like let's say in here you have like International Friendship Day. Now, and the way I write is that something that perhaps like some secondary school students can do, especially with regards to the statistics, right? So what kind of level of acceptance is there, you know, like let's say in schools, or let's say in the workplace. In the workplace, it's of course there's more data on that, so you can look at it. So of course there will be stereotypes, you know, politics in the workplace. So let's look, you can definitely search on Google about all this. So now this is in a secondary school, and let's say in a primary school level. How about on a tertiary level, right? So a lot of programs are created in order to integrate exchange students and permanent foreigners. And this is very true, especially for like NUS, where I come from. Now, the reason why they want to do it is not, I don't think that they necessarily really care about the students, but I think that a lot of the times they need to justify its ranking. Now, of course, you know, some of my friends may not believe in this, but in a way, it's actually true, because there was this period of time when I was in a lecture, and then suddenly there was a stormtrooper from like Star Wars suddenly like running around, and there was actually somebody filming it, and then without the stormtrooper, he actually films like the NUS students, like in my lecture theater, like, you know, being happy. And so I felt like, oh my God, this is like such a scam, you know, because it's not necessarily how the students feel, because a lot of the times it's very competitive. And so of course you can generally have like data on, you know, the diversity of the students background, and like let's say what kind of programs that they have. But of course this is the counter argument, so you want to make it seem as if, you know, it's strong, right? So you have to really push yourself to say, okay, because of these platforms, at least it allows for the interaction to occur. Without the interaction, what will happen? Now, I didn't put it on this slide, but definitely you guys can look into it, you know? So without this, what will happen? It's not really maybe the significance is so big, but without it, maybe bad things will happen, right? Because, you know, Singapore always derives everything from like its past and its history about whatever things that happened, the racial riots, the Mara Hertog case and all that. So there's definitely a lot of substantiation for the reasons why it does things like International Friendship Day, even though it may seem superficial, right? So, okay, let me bring you to the next slide. Now, here, you need to find evidence that the government basically facilitates the community integration. Oh, sorry, you facilitates integration through the use of, like, let's say, funds that governmental bodies do. So just now I was talking about like educational institutions, but over here you see something slightly different. Now, the reason why I want to do it, it's definitely a very long paragraph, yes, and you can break it up into two. But this doesn't mean that, you know, it's too content heavy, and you know, you want to separate, you want to have like a lot of points and everything. Actually, it's still talking about the same thing. It's just that I'm broadening the aspects of your counter argument so that it becomes stronger as well. Because in education and in, like, let's say the workplace or another side of the other side of governmental bodies, and in here it's the National Integration Council. Basically, it's very different, and so you want your essay to have a lot of basically it has to be very broad. Okay, so now in here, basically it says that the fund has up to like $200,000, and it will constitute like 80% of total funds needed to fund the project. Now, why do I think this is important? It means that even though you pay like 20%, but a lot of the big scale events they actually require a lot of money. So in a sense, this 80% actually also shows that you want also a good investment for people who really want to help and to help them with financial needs. But it also means that they have to be serious enough, right, in order to actually do it. Because the 20% they have to basically get it from their own money, or let's say they do it through fundraising. So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. And sometimes the criteria for all these funds are really strict. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it's free money, right? So you need to find data about like the NGOs or the social enterprises that work to help immigrants. And definitely there are a lot of them, especially for domestic workers, because there has been like a lot of cases of abuse of like, let's say, Filipino or like Indonesian maids, right? So there are a lot of NGOs that start to help on this. And perhaps like the social enterprises, they want to do a business, and then maybe they want to help like, let's say, those immigrants that perhaps don't have a lot of money. And then how are they going to help them? Because a lot of them basically live in poverty. And they always say that in Singapore there's no poverty, but that may not necessarily be true, because there's a lot of underground poverty in that sense, right? So even for amongst the locals themselves, there are homeless people, or like there are people who really don't have a lot of money, and like, let's say, the elderly. So they may have assets, but they don't really have cash, right? So if you compare it with, like, let's say, a poor person from another country, yes, perhaps it's relative poverty, but you need to look at it also based on the national context. What about the income gap? That's the reason why this is an important thing, because integration also means that there's a lot of distribution of equality in that sense. So in this paragraph, maybe if you want, you can also add in like more data about like inclusive in terms of finances. Maybe we can have it in another paragraph. I didn't put it like on the main points that I'm going to give. Maybe I'll talk about it later. Okay. So back to this point about like the significance of this kind of social events that are incentivized by the government, right? Because they are giving a lot of funds. So I'm not trying to stereotype things, so definitely you have to give a lot of data on this, right? So, but what I can see is that, especially if you watch Eric Khoo's 12 Stories, basically it talks about like how communities in Singapore tend to be very isolated. So events such as this are very important in bonding the people, because basically this means that you get out of your routine, and there are a lot of platforms for you to uh, say out like whatever, however you feel, and really get in touch with the community. And I think this is something that Singapore doesn't really focus on, and also perhaps because the government recognizes that it's an important issue. It's just that a lot of the times the people themselves are in their own world. So how do we deal with this? Like, let's say for a lot of the HDB flats, like they don't really get together, like let's say only the uncles, let's say, they do it in hawker centers, but this doesn't mean that the community itself actually is bonding so much. So it's kind of sad. So that's the reason why this integration thing is important, not only in terms of the immigrants, but also in terms of society in itself, the Singapore society that is made up of the locals, right? So now I have basically talked about how people who are living in close proximity, they may not necessarily be bonded, and so it's very important for uh, this kind of NGOs or social enterprises to actually intervene in that sense and to really promote something more. And I realized that a lot of people are actually pretty sad and resentful of the fact that this is happening. There's no like real bonding between the people, and sometimes we are too connected in terms of like technology that we don't really care about other people, and we are always on our phones and everything. So it's kind of sad. That's the reason why sometimes it's good to disconnect and to really like focus on this kind of events, right? So the progress that has been focusing on like um, the emphasis that has been put on progress are generally uh, done at the expense of really bonding with people. Okay, so yeah. So in this paragraph, of course, sorry, I've talked about like the competitiveness, right? So it's this is right. Sorry. Okay, so this is the thing that I really wanted to talk about. It's about citizen participation. So this is the thing that can make up a really vibrant civil society that I think Singapore really needs as well. Okay, so back to the slide, this new slide. Now, after you finish your counter argument, and of course you're basically gonna like give a lot of conclusive statement about how Singapore society has become more inclusive, and therefore like the counter argument stands. Now, after this, in GP, what you do is you have to have an argument that directly addresses whatever you said. Now, a lot of the time, schools don't emphasize on this because you can just basically talk about any other counter argument. But this is not true because it has to address everything that the counter argument says. Now, this is important because the marker will know that the counter argument is important and it exists, but the argument is so better, like what I've said before. Now, this makes a very strong case. Now, as you are not, sorry, and you as you are not necessarily like arguing only for what you supposedly believe in. Now, this is another thing that I really want to say for GP. Don't ever write on topics that are very sensitive to yourself. Like, let's say it's about religion and you are a very avid, like, let's say Christian or like Muslim. Don't write on that because your judgment will definitely be affected in that sense. So write something that is neutral and you don't really care too much about it, but it's still important and you can write about it. That's why I always focus on like current affairs, like the environment, because those things I care about them, but it's not until like I die that I have to like do a lot of things, right? So okay, now in this paragraph, I've highlighted the flaws of the counter argument. So, of course, like we all know that the government initiatives that I was telling you about are very superficial, right? So, like what I've written here, it is up to an individual whether he wants to utilize the events, right? So, and I think this is also important, like whatever I said, the Racial Harmony Day and International Friendship Day are superficial because they're just dates. It's the same as like Valentine's Day or like Christmas Day or like Halloween Day. Why do we need to have like a lot of these celebrations? Fine, they're there to get us out of our mundane routine, but that also means that it's superficial because it's only like, okay, so that means you need to celebrate this for like one day. Then how about every single day? Because racial harmony is something that you have to do every day. What about the pledge? Does it really mean anything, right? So you have to analyze it. And then basically, it's true that it takes a lot of effort to build understanding and acceptance, especially when there's a lot of construction of the other, as what I've told you about. Now, in education institutions, as like for myself, right? So the provision of scholarships, like what I've gone through, makes it harder for integration because of the academic gap. So when I was a scholar, it was really tough because a lot of people tend to think that we are really smart and everything, and we're there to like take the people's jobs, when it's nonsense. Like a lot of us are just there to really be a normal student, and a lot of us are really not that smart. It's only those like, let's say from China, or like even not everybody from China. Like some of them, they get like 10 A1s and everything. But for the rest of us, we're really just normal students. But it took me like really a very long time to really integrate. But once I've integrated, it's good because the people saw that I really made the effort, right? So again, the problem with secondary school and JC is that the competition is very blatant. And so it really depends on like the Singaporean students to work even harder not to lose out. Now, this is why it becomes problematic because the scholarships are there to really pressurize and tekan everyone, and that's not really very nice. Like, especially when you're like a 16-year-old or 17-year-old, you really just want to have fun. Like you want to relax a bit. Like even though you're a very academic person, but you know that you are still very young, and so you don't like it when there's even extra competition because everybody is already competing against each other. Like let's say for elite institutions, right? So now let's say we have to go to the crux of the issue, and like let's say for educational institutions where so the problem is not solved, right? And then um, basically because of this, there's like a systemic disincentive to make friends with each other because of the outright competition that the school places, right? On like let's say between the foreigners and the scholars, specifically and the locals, because a lot of the foreigners who come to secondary schools are actually scholars, especially for the good schools. So there's always a differentiation, like even like in the system itself, everything is always about like scholars and students, so it's different. So the school obviously finds it very beneficial because these people will boost the ranking of the school. But this doesn't mean that it's necessarily healthy for the students themselves. So a lot of the times people always question like, why do we actually need foreign talent, right? And of course, as a foreign talent, I completely sympathize with that. I'm not saying that like a lot of foreign talent is necessarily bad, but at the same time, it's also not necessarily good because a lot of the times it's very indiscriminate. Like I always talked about like how foreigners are very economically viable, but I've seen like how some people they don't really work hard, for a lot of things, and they're like basically here under like government money. So I think that you've already taken like some money from the SG government. At least you need to contribute, you need to integrate. I think that's like the basic thing that you have to do because you're in another person's country, So anyway, now okay, in the paragraph I also talk about like how in the tertiary level. Now the problem is this: I've taught GP for many years, and I understand that there are a lot of my students who can't enter like NUS, NTU, or SMU, or even like SUTD. So or like they're not interested in SUTD. So it becomes really sad because like you feel like, oh my God, I've worked so hard for my JC life and it's really tough. So because like let's say for local universities, only the top 20%, if I'm not mistaken, can manage to enter, which makes it really tough for everybody because it's already so hard, and then there are like this bunch of foreigners who suddenly come, and there's a substantial amount. I'm not sure about the exact statistics, but probably it's around like 20 to 30%, and a lot of seats are not given to Singaporeans, and it's really sad because especially those from Polytechnic, it's really tough for them to enter. So of course there will definitely be resentment because like you work really hard, but you don't really get priority in that sense. Why are these like people getting the priority? And I'm not even talking about meritocracy because there are some people like let's say from China who come over to Singapore, and the problem is that they don't actually work so hard for it because they don't have to go to A levels. Now, what is the equivalent of an A level degree? It's really tough to say because A level is probably like one of the most difficult exams. It's not even like Cambridge A level, Singapore Cambridge A level. So sometimes I question it, like, okay, fine, you have to be like really smart, like a physics Olympiad, like from Indonesia in order to get into like local universities. But how about like, other things? Like, why is it so necessary to provide these like students with the ability to come over to Singapore when obviously like those who went through JC have basically suffered so much for like 2 years, or like in MI's case 3 years, right? So I'm not trying to judge anything, but I feel that in this issue it's very sensitive, and even for me, like as a foreigner, it becomes tough because a lot of the times, like in JC, we had to go through certain things that people who directly came to university didn't have to experience. So it becomes tough. Now, this is why the raw data is very important, and I'm pretty sure you can find a lot of data about like the problems that are associated with like foreigners entering local universities. And of course, there are some immigrants who like don't know how to behave. So like there was like this guy from I think China who like basically say that the locals are like dogs, and then there was so much like anger towards it. And I'm pretty sure if I was Singaporean, I would feel the same way, right? So talk about like these real life examples. I know that it's not very recent, so like it's good to have like very recent stuff, but there will always be a lot of things that you can talk about when it comes to like statistics. Okay, so now in here, I have basically talked about like the how Singapore society has not become more inclusive, and I have highlighted to you the major flaws about like the previous counter argument. Like let's say even for the funds themselves, like 80% is going to be given back to you, so that's not a pretty bad investment if you look at it that way. 20% is still a very small amount. So because of that, technically speaking, people can just abuse the system. So it's important to always highlight like the the flaws. Okay, it's like the um, whether something really works out or whether something really doesn't.